I want to thank everyone for joining us today and for bearing with us as we start another virtual press conference. You saw my mask of the day is vote. This is a public service announcement. Please, please, please vote today. Get those ballots in the mail. Many parts of the country are thinking about moving to vote by mail. Let's show them how it's done. Voting is very important. In June, I transmitted my rebalanced budget for 2020. It has been a year of just remarkable challenges, including a global pandemic, an economic downturn, and the closure of the West Seattle Bridge. On top of that, we have seen a nationwide and citywide reckoning on civil rights. The 2020 proposal and rebalanced budget was required because of these emergencies. The amount of money that the city gets in revenues drop, and we have to have a balanced budget. Our 2020 proposal included $20 million in cuts to the Seattle Police Department budget this year, which represents 10% of the budget for the remainder of the year. These cuts were driven by the full involvement of the Seattle Police Department and Chief Carmen Best, which is the right way to go about transforming the Seattle Police Department. The city charter vests in Chief Carmen Best the management responsibilities for the Seattle Police Department. Since we transmitted our balancing package, the chief and I have emphasized that those cuts were all that were feasible this year in order to accommodate the process of moving things out of the department, as well as making sure that we could maintain a level for public safety. Anything beyond that $20 million, we knew and were advised would be tangled up in various legal proceedings. Chief Best did an admirable job and worked very hard with her department to find savings this year to show that the department could reform itself and could really look at what its necessary functions were. Again, $20 million, which was 10% of the remaining SPD budget. Understanding that 2020 is not the best playing field to discuss further reductions for SPD and reinvestment in community, a month ago, Chief Best and I outlined our plan to begin changes now that could be accomplished as part of next year's budget, which we will start late this summer and have to finish by November. So understanding that community expected us to take an even harder look at the budget for next year, a month ago we outlined things that we could do on that front. We believe that we can build a community safety model where not every 911 call results in an armed officer responding. We want to ensure that people get the help that they need. It could be a medic, a social worker, a counselor, and sometimes it absolutely has to be a police officer. And when they need them now. We want to look at SPD specialty units and determine who's serving the communities best, particularly communities of color. We want to further invest in programs like Health One, where people get a public health response that they need. We identified $76 million in initial budget reductions for next year, $20 million of which are cuts, and $56 million accomplished by transferring functions that do not need to be conducted by law enforcement personnel. Look, we've made clear throughout the summer and into the fall that we will engage with community on an ongoing basis to analyze every SPD function and the 911 dispatch and response. That work, led by the chief, is underway now, and it will inform our 2021 budget transmittal. I've got to be clear because some people just don't understand. The chief and I share the goal of much of Seattle. We want to lead the nation in reimagining policing. We know that we can do that and still protect public safety and have a system in place where people get the help they need 24/7 in every part of the city. Again, nearly a month ago, Chief Best and I expressed serious concerns about cutting the 2020 budget for the Seattle Police Department by an arbitrary 50%. We want to be honest with individuals about the challenges and consequences that we understood at the time and now. Again, you're going to hear it straight from us. We're going to tell you when we think we can do something, and we're going to go about and try to do it. We're going to listen to community and really listen and try to do even more. But against that backdrop, 7 of 9 council members announced that they supported a 50% cut this year. At first, it was unclear whether they meant 50% of the whole budget, which would have zeroed it out for all of this year. That was clarified to be 50% for what is left. But now, most of the 7 council members who made that pledge now acknowledge that a blunt 50% cut in 2020 is not only ill-advised, it's simply not possible. Some of the proposals that council put forward on reductions to specialty units are being evaluated by the chief and the Seattle Police Department. Things like mounted patrol, harbor patrol, recruitment and retention, and transferring victim advocates. The chief will continue to look at her department and really think about how we reimagine policing. But neither she or I will ever sacrifice public safety for that in any part of this city. We want to make sure that if someone calls 911, the response time to help them in emergency is as quick as can be. We think the council is looking in the right places but in the wrong year. Council has made recommendations now in their new balancing packet where they basically admitted that the chief and I were right. You can't cut by 50% this year. And now, though, they want to reduce the force by 100 officers in 2020. But there is almost no way to cut those officers in the way that council has requested. And it is impossible to do it by November of 2020 of this year. Look, council, the chief, and I all agree that we don't want to lay off our newest recruits and our newest officers. These are the people who've joined the force knowing that we were under federal oversight. They are our most diverse class ever, with 39% of them people of color. And they are so committed to reform and to community policing. These are exactly the officers that we want to stay and build the future of the Seattle Police Department. But by labor rules that the City Council knows, Spd layoffs must be conducted by seniority, meaning that the youngest, most diverse officers would be the first to go. Those 100 layoffs the council wants to do this year would gut that new class and those new recruits. To avoid laying off this officer, council suggests that the chief can just go out of order. They know that's simply not possible, and it is impossible to do it by November of 2020. That process, going out of order, can sometimes be used for 1 or 2 and has historically been done so, but it is a time-consuming, drawn-out process where the chief would have to justify every single one of the decisions to go out of process. And every officer who was laid off, who wouldn't have been, has rights that have to be litigated. There is no doubt that the council acknowledges this, that layoffs are also subject to bargaining. And we've already received demands to bargain from nearly every single one of the unions represented by SPD. So suggesting that you would not lose the diverse class is really not being wholly honest with the people of Seattle. The City Council knows that we are hamstrung by state law and labor rules, and the first 100 officers to go would be some of those we want to keep the most. So in 2020, if council really wants to reduce the force of officers by 100, let's acknowledge that it means that you're going to lay off the most diverse, our recruits, our new student officers. That's the reality of it. The chief and I do not believe that that is worth the trade-off of $1.6 million. It takes the police department, and it takes policing in our city, and it takes us in the wrong direction. Instead, the chief and I have outlined a plan in 21 to evaluate specialty departments and attrition, and we will bargain when necessary We are ready to go back to the table. We have told community we want them at the table. We want a contract that reflects the values of Seattle. But we cannot, again, just lay off 100 officers. And next year's plan would perhaps be another 100 to 200. That would be a reduction of almost 300 officers in a 14-month period. I also, and the chief also, oppose the transitioning of the data-driven policing and the elimination of implicit bias training. Really concerning to me is the data-driven policing. We want more of that. We want to understand not just where crime is happening, but what deployments are happening, what crime strategies are working, where do we see crime going up, and what types of crimes, so that we can work for the public safety and community safety of every neighborhood in Seattle. All of that would be transferred out of the department under council's plan. They also, ironically, would eliminate implicit bias training. But most concerning to me is council's current proposal would completely drain our rainy day fund. Chief Best in the city will be leading extensive community-based engagement because we think it's the right thing to do. We want to go and talk more to community about what are those things that police officers are doing today that they agree we need to be doing into the future. What are those things that perhaps somebody else can respond, and how do we build up that capability? That can't happen overnight. Draining our rainy day fund to zero is the wrong way to go about budgeting for the city of Seattle. Look, 2020 has been an awful year. We are facing a global pandemic, a huge economic downturn, a civil rights uprising. The budget of our city has been hit probably proportionally more than it has ever been hit before. On top of that, we had the West Seattle Bridge closure and failure. I'm not confident that in 2020 and 2021, there won't be more emergencies. We know that to defer some of the rainy day fund today, it's the only cash we have in the bank. With this proposal on top of the council's recently passed spending plan, literally they are zeroing out our rainy day funds and our emergency funds. Look, we are an emergency, and we have been and will continue to be an emergency for some time. Many people have seen COVID numbers are increasing throughout the country. We've doubled down in Seattle to bring those numbers down. We've stood up more testing than anywhere in the state. But unless we change course, we will have $0 as a financial cushion in the midst of the three biggest challenges our city's had in the history of the city. I want to be clear, I am absolutely willing to work with council and any council member on solving any of the problems we have before us. I think we have shared goals, and we can find a way forward. I think the process of polarization is not good for the city. I was pleased to be able to talk to Council President Lorena Gonzalez today, who agrees that we want to find a way in the next budget cycle to have a better way to collaborate. But I'll say this, if we really want to reimagine policing in this city, and we want the Seattle Police Department to be able to deliver public safety, there is no person better situated to help guide us in that than Chief Carmen Best. She is given the responsibility to manage this department by our city charter. That's how important the role is. She also has 30 years of experience in the department. She came on as a patrol officer. She knows every one of those specialty units, how they operate, how they function, and how we might rethink what we do in a policing. I have to say, I am disappointed, and I will say a bit surprised, that to date, council has never reached out to sit down with the chief to hear her thoughts on how this department could be made better, how we can reimagine it, how we can make sure that the men and women of the Seattle Police Department can serve the people of Seattle. None of us has all the answers. No department in the country has all the answers. No police department anywhere in the country or in the globe has it all right. But Seattle can lead. But to lead, we have an obligation to understand that this city needs to have policing, but we can reimagine what that policing is. And we have a national leader at the helm of our police department. I am honored to work with her. I listen to her advice and counsel. I think council should start doing that also. While undertaking to defund the Seattle Police Department in the midst of one of the most consequential times in our history, I would just urge council again, take some time. Take some time to get this right. I think it's a step forward that you've admitted you were wrong. You couldn't cut the department by 50% this year. But next year, let's work together to see how we can reimagine policing, to engage communities in every part of this city. And let's tap into Chief Best. She is best positioned to help us transform this department. And the chief has repeatedly said she's willing to do it. You've heard that when council starts to say go forward on their plans, it's the only way she can get a voice in now, because they don't call her, they don't consult with her, they don't have a process by which that is, to do it by letter. That's not the way to do this kind of budgeting for a department in one of the most sensitive times in the history of the Seattle Police Department. We've got this moment in time to get it right. We will only get it right if we work together and listen to community together. As someone who has worked on police reform for over 35 years, I get no one wants to hear about the roadblocks to progress. I get that there is a sense of urgency like there has never been before. And I know that when I said I did not believe we could cut the police department by 50% this year, it was very unpopular in many places. But I have an obligation as mayor to tell you the truth. We have shown that we can tackle big problems, we can take them head on. We met the pandemic head on, we flattened the curve, our city has more free testing than any place in the state, and we have provided the community with $230 million in relief since the pandemic began. In just a matter of months, the city has mobilized $230 million in direct relief. My job of mayor is to level with the people of Seattle. I have a responsibility to make clear what I think the city can do, to go to work to do it, and not be afraid of tackling things just because they're hard. I pledge I will continue to do that when it comes to policing and civil rights in this city. I absolutely believe that protesters have a First Amendment right to protest, but I also believe that protest is good for our city, our state, and our nation. We were a country born of protest. First Amendment rights make us stronger. Seattle, the thing that can really impede transformational change is if this just devolves to a political partisan battle. We should not make hasty decisions, we should make right decisions. That doesn't mean slow, it just means thoughtful. There is a right way to right-size policing. But anyone who thinks it can happen overnight really isn't looking at the facts. This last year, I put in my budget more money than we'd had before for community-based programs like Community Passageways and Choose 180. We have all sorts of programs to go upstream and really help people not get involved in the criminal justice system. We now know those work, and we've got to scale them up. But if someone calls 911 at midnight in the Duwamish Valley, or in Laurelhurst, or in Rainier Valley, someone has to respond right away. And we don't have that capability right now. We need to have that capability. So in close, I want to say the chief and I, again, we are absolutely committed to reimagining how policing works in the city, to having a better community-based response, to have a public health and harm reduction-based response. But we also know that policing is complicated and that sometimes you do need a police officer to respond. Just in the last months, we've seen a number of shootings in different parts of the city. When that kind of violent crime happens and people dial 911, they expect a police officer to show up, and a police officer has to show up. That doesn't mean there isn't other types of help that can't respond. It just means that for right now in our city, we have to be truthful and honest and realistic with one another. And with that, I'll turn it over to Chief Best.
Let me just say thank you, Mayor Durkan. Thank you very much for your steadfast support of public safety in Seattle. I and the entire Seattle Police Department have heard loud and clear the demands of so many in the community. Each of us understands what gives voice to these demands. We acknowledge the history of policing, and we commit to growing and improving policing. There is absolutely no question that we will do better. The Seattle Police Department is a national model because of our commitment to continuously improving. We have met and exceeded every component of the consent decree. We continue to demonstrate that we are committed to innovation. We have embraced transparency and oversight and have one of the most robust civilian accountability systems in the country, with an Office of Police Accountability, an Office of Inspector General, and our Community Police Commission. We launched the first of its kind in the country police community assessments of disparity and enforcement in these actions. And we have more planned. You know, we're going to make mistakes. That is why we have these systems in place, to investigate them, to hold people accountable, and to make substantive changes when they are warranted. And I say all of this to you, that your police department hears you and I hear you. The entirety of the SPD has been engaged in these types of community conversation for years. We remain steady. Importantly, though, a lesson learned is we cannot tell community what we always know is best for the community. We know we can function better, more efficiently, more equitably. We also know the community has great ideas. So we are not going to make all of these decisions alone. They need to be community-led. We are already putting the work in and will continue to put the work in to make improvements to this department, and we expect you, actually we implore you to hold us accountable. We know that re-envisioning community safety will include changes to the Spd budget. That is a given, some of which the City Council is already proposing. And I want to talk briefly about some of those proposals that are what they are and what impacts they might have on community safety. Overall, there are some good approaches in the proposals. Some of the ideas SPD already had and has raised before. But what is problematic is these are approaches without any clarity on how they will become reality. What is the plan? The push from council and some of our community is to do these large-scale changes in 2020 with no practical plan for community safety. And I believe wholeheartedly that is completely reckless. Council has directed me to lay off 70 or more officers, basically overnight. And I cannot do that in good faith, knowing there are no systems in place to bridge the gap. You know, and that is something that will invariably happen. There will be a gap in services. As the mayor mentioned, at midnight when you're calling for someone to assist you for a rape, a robbery, or other kind of condition, there needs to be a response, and people expect that. My charter responsibility is to run and to manage the Seattle Police Department. I am responsible for the public safety. It is not acceptable for the council to tell me what to have my officers and civilians do in the granular way that they have tried to manage. And regardless of how anyone supposes a layoff process would work, I know we could not do that level of layoffs out of order. It would be illegal and inappropriate to do so, and it would mean cutting off, even if I could do it, it would mean cutting off and laying off our students, our recruits, and some of our probationary officers. Those that we hired in recent years that have been a record-breaking cohort of diverse hires in experience, in race, ethnicity, and gender. And I don't want to lose them. We've worked really hard to have a police department that reflects the community that we serve. And to undercut that and undermine it doesn't make sense to me. The council suggests that the Seattle Police Department would be better off if we do not use data. Really? I find this particularly confusing, given many of the same council members called for a city auditor to analyze our data analytics, and they recommended, through that audit, making it more robust, not cutting it. Best practices is in almost every public and private sector, along with proven research practices in policing, demand that organizations measure what works and measure what matters, and they're guided by data and evidence. The council also suggests the public would be better served if we did not have a public affairs unit. Police departments across the country are often the busiest in terms of the media requests that come in and the information requests that are made daily, hourly, almost to the minute within all of our police agencies. If this unit was disbanded, all of those requests would go through a public disclosure process, which is much more onerous and already overworked and overstrapped. Slowing down the process of getting information to the public is simply not in line with increasing the department's transparency. And I won't go into all of the legal issues around how so many of these actions would bring the city directly in conflict with the consent decree. The oversight that, by the way, the council recently called on for the city to make sure that we continue. The Seattle Police Department met every one of its requirements under the consent decree and continues to work through every issue identified. Remaining in compliance is now a matter of a city issue, and reducing training, analytics, transparency, and especially staffing is not how the city will meet the court's expectations. Together, aside from the drastic staffing cuts and the effect they would have on public safety, I am wholeheartedly dismayed at the apparent attempts to both direct the day-to-day operations of the police department as well as the concerted effort to dismantle almost every component of improvement in innovation and collaboration. It is almost as if some of these folks are just concerned that too many people actually support the police department and want to see public safety survive in this city. So my commitment to you today and every day is that the Seattle Police Department is ready to serve the people of Seattle together. My command team has completed an initial assessment of every function of the department with an eye toward the ones the department feels should function differently. We will equally consider suggestions from every member of the department, and we need to hear from every member of the community. We have the opportunity, with time, to be thoughtful and grounded in research, to lead the nation and continue to lead the nation on the journey to a new model of community safety, above and beyond the consent decree. And I really and truly want that. The department wants that. If we haphazardly undercut the work while trying to rebalance the 2020 budget, I am deeply concerned we will lose that opportunity. In closing, I just want to say the members of the Seattle Police Department, we work for the community. We're a part of the community and not apart from the community. This is all of us working together for community safety. And I remain optimistic about re-envisioning the future of our community, the future of safety with input from the community. Again, we are all in this together. Thank you.
Seattle Emerald. Patrick, the floor is yours. My question's for Chief Best. The mayor outlined $76 million in cuts for next year. What I did quick math, that's about a defunding plan of 19%. I just talked with a council member. Their cuts starting tomorrow up for vote, but then leading into next year are planning for a 41 to 42% defunding plan for 2021. How does that number challenge your commitment to public safety?
Thank you, Patrick. Obviously, there's never going to be anything that is more important to me than making sure that we have efficient public safety in the city of Seattle. I feel like you're very fortunate to have had that conversation with council because they certainly haven't been talking to me. We're going to work through all of the challenges ahead of us. We want to make sure that we are thoughtful about how we re-envision policing. We want to make sure that the community is involved in those discussions. I would hope that moving forward, no matter what the cuts end up being, that we're thoughtful about making sure that we have the appropriate resources available to make sure that we have comprehensive public safety in Seattle.
Patrick, this is Jenny. I'm going to follow up just briefly. I'm not sure which council member that you spoke with, but I've reviewed their resolution, and it does not call for cuts of that magnitude. And I think we are right back where we were a few weeks ago when you had all these council members saying that they were going to cut it by 50% because that's what the activists were demanding of them. And they had no plan, and then once they looked at the details, realized they couldn't do it. In contrast to that, the chief and I stood before everyone, and it was unpopular in many quarters to say, we can't make those cuts this year. You have our same word that we will look next year to see what we can cut, and more importantly, what can we grow? It's not just about what we cut. How do we grow a different capacity in every neighborhood, in every community, so that there is more resilience there, more wellness there? So again, I think it's just a false pretext to throw a number out there and say that's what they're for.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Chief. Our next question will be from Carolyn Bick, South Seattle Emerald, followed by Daniel Beekman, Seattle Times. Carolyn? Floor is yours.
Patrick, I'm sorry, I think actually that Patrick didn't get a follow-up question, unless I missed it.
Due to time constraints, we're going to move forward without follow-up questions. Carolyn, the floor is yours.
Okay, got it. Thank you. All right, Mayor Durkan, Chief Best, I want to take this opportunity to ask about allegations raised by several protesters about the way SPD treated them on the weekend of the 25th, since only limited press was invited to the press conference last week. There are several videos of SPD officers once again using excessive force against protesters who appear to be doing nothing wrong, and the allegations are numerous and include corroborating reports from multiple people about officers taunting and mocking a young woman who repeatedly pleaded for her seizure medication and suffered multiple seizures while detained. When I asked SPD response to the allegations, the only response I got was that protesters should file complaints with the OPA. SPD media didn't even bother to ask what the allegations were, so I wanted to ask today, how are you going to address these allegations and hold these officers accountable? It seems to some that constantly telling protesters to file complaints with the OPA puts the onus solely on these protesters and the rest of the public at large to hold officers accountable when said officers are out in the field presumably acting under orders from SPD.
So I'm going to let the chief respond to that mostly, Carolyn, and I apologize you don't get follow-ups on this. First, I think that you saw that the city filed in court its brief in response to some of the allegations and video clips that seemed to show that there was unauthorized use of force, but the video clip itself was incomplete, and they showed that to the judge. I want to say that if there's any police officer who does use force inappropriately, the chief and I are united without any hesitation to say that officer will be investigated and this chief of police will hold them accountable. But we also know that last weekend that there was a series of events that were very challenging for the police department, including an arson that burned several trailers, attempted arson at a business that was broken into that had residential things above it. There were business owners who were assaulted, and the police precinct itself was subject to attack. So it was a very fluid situation, And again, the values of us are we will make sure that the very robust, independent, civilian-led accountability system works and has the resources it needs to work. And if there's any individual officer who's broken the rules, they'll be held accountable. And if the department as a whole has policies and procedures that need to be reviewed and changed because of that conduct, we now have 2 federal judges and the Office of Inspector General looking at those. And the chief will take all of that very seriously. Chief?
Yeah, Carolyn, thank you for your very lengthy question, and I agree with the mayor. She's covered a lot of it, but absolutely, there's some serious challenges that we faced over the course of these many demonstrations, many of them enumerated just by the mayor. The complaints have been made, the documentation has been filed in court. I have every confidence in our judicial system and in our processes that they will ferret out and get to the truth. And that's all we really want is the truth of what occurred. And if there were violations, I can assure you that people will be held responsible for it. We wholeheartedly, I personally wholeheartedly, and as an organization, wholeheartedly support First Amendment free speech. But allegations of excessive force, dealing with the very volatile situation that we were addressing, will absolutely be reviewed, and we will make sure that the facts lead us to the truth.
And Carol, I just want to add 2 other things is I had not heard of the woman with seizures, and I don't know if the police chief did, but they will follow up on that to see what it is. Second is we are not leaving it just on protesters to file complaints. The OPA itself has initiated a number of complaints. The chief of police has initiated complaints. And I myself, the night after the Pink Umbrella video, met with OPA and OIG and then later with CPC and asked them to review our policies, procedures, and other issues related to crowd control. So we're not just waiting for people to step up and make complaints. We also are going to do everything we can to hold the department accountable.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Chief. Our next question will come from Daniel Beekman, Seattle Times, followed by Hannah Scott, Cairo Radio. Daniel, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, and this is a question for, I suppose, the chief, but the mayor, if she cares to respond to it as well, about the potential 100 officer reduction in 2020. With regards to the potential proposed layoffs, I want to make sure I understand, Chief, what you said before about trying to go out of order and saying that would be a difficult process. Would you seek to go out of order if these proposed cuts were passed by the council? And then also with the proposed 30 officer unplanned attrition, do you think that prediction that 30 more officers than previously thought would resign, do you think that that's a realistic prediction?
Well, for your first question, all the guidelines about layoffs and the order of layoffs, they're going to be handled by the Public Safety Civil Service Commission and by the Labor Relations. So there's a lot of complexities involved in how that process can move forward for out-of-order layoffs. My understanding is very complex and very complete and a lot of nuance to how that might be done. But the fact of the matter is, in terms of laying off people by race, that is simply illegal. So that suggestion really, in my view, is off the table. But again, a lot of that will be determined by labor law, negotiations, labor relations, and the Public Safety Civil Service Commission. Your second question that was sort of incorporated was, I believe, about the level of attrition toward the end of the year. Clearly, we're not clairvoyant. There's a lot of speculation about what might occur towards year end. We'll have to really get to that point to see if that many people either retire or resign. We expect there will be some, but we don't know exactly what that number is going to be.
And Dan, I'll just follow up on that a little bit. The question of will she follow it presumes, number one, that this is what they passed. We're hoping it's not. We hope they rethink it just as they rethought their previous position. But second, it is smoke and mirrors. It cannot happen. And if the chief had said to you, yes, I will go out of order, that would have probably been an unfair labor practice that opened the city to further challenges. So I just have to emphasize that this 100 officers we want to cut, and then they try to pick out the ones that they think the public would support cutting, that isn't how it will work. It will be the 100 officers who are least senior. It'll be our most diverse recruits and the people we brought into the department to be that new vision of the future.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Chief. Our next question will come from Hannah Scott, Cairo Radio, followed by David Croman, Crosscut. Hannah, the floor is yours.
Hi, this is both for Mayor and Chief Best. Chief Best, much has been made about your address in Snohomish County. I'm wondering if it wouldn't be better for building trust with and understanding communities better for the police chief to live in the community in the department where she works.
Yeah, Hannah, that's been brought up before, and I have had residents here in Seattle. There are some personal situations where I needed to be back at that Snohomish residence for a time. So I agree. I think it's very important that the chief have residents here in Seattle. And I think that doesn't leave me any less connected to the city and the people in it. This is a temporary situation. But absolutely, I would agree with you. But I don't want that to in any way be a reflection on my level of commitment to the men and women of the organization, and certainly to the public who lives, works, and visits the city of Seattle, which I also love and believe in. So thank you for asking that question and seeking clarification.
Thank you, Chief. Our next question will come from David Croman, followed by Natalie Swaby. David, the floor is yours.
Yeah, this is for the mayor. As part of, you've spoken a lot about reimagining the police department. As part of that, do you ever see that it will be appropriate to reduce the overall size of the Seattle Police Department? And if not, how do you pay for a reimagining of the police department?
Great question, and the short answer is yes. I do think that you can reimagine policing so that you reduce the footprint of the armed police officers and increase the more public health based responses. But to do that, you have to have that resource in place. And it has to have a resource that has adequate training, so they too, when they respond from a 911 call to come into community, have consistent training, that they know how to de-escalate, they know how to recognize situations that might need additional solutions or even armed response. They need to have a ability to respond 24/7, and you need to have an array of resources. Health One is great, but it wouldn't be the right response for every non-police intervention today. So you're going to need a whole range. So I think that you can. I think there's going to be a period of time where you have to build up that capacity first before you can draw it down in the police department. I think when this all happened, I recall that you asked me about Camden, New Jersey, and whether that could be a model for reimagining policing here. And a number of council members used that as an example. But if you look at Camden, the reason it was dismantled was because of a political fight by the Republican governor, Chris Christie, at the time. He created a new police department that, by everyone's estimation, did not work and did not serve community well. They then had to restructure and reform that department, and they actually ended up with more police officers than when they started to deconstruct it. So I think, again, we shouldn't be looking just at the numbers of how many police do we have. We should be really looking at how do we, number one, invest in community. Invest in communities so that every kid in Seattle grows up in the situation where they and their families have access to affordable housing, good education, economic opportunity, health care. Make it so people don't have to call 911 as many times. And then when they do call 911, we can get them the help they need. And sometimes that will be your traditional police officer, and sometimes it won't. So yes, I think in the future that if we get that all right, you can have a reduced number of people that have to be traditional police officers. But it's not a numbers game. It's an outcome. It's an outcome that you want to keep communities safe and resilient.
Thank you, Mayor. It appears as Natalie Swaby is no longer on the call, so we will go to Paul Kiefer from the C is for Crank, followed by Natalie Graham, the Stranger. Paul, the floor is yours.
All right. Hello. On what case law are you basing your claim that every one of the out-of-order layoffs would be subject to litigation? What case law has been useful in coming up with that determination?
Hey, Paul, first, congratulations on the new job and welcome to the press conference. You won't see it just as case law. It's a very complicated area of law that we can get you a lawyer to sit down and school with you, but every individual who's laid off has to be taken case by case. You can't just take 100 and say, these 100. And any individual who shouldn't be laid off under the traditional rules has a right to challenge that. That takes a period of time. It can take months and many, many months. So there's a whole system, both state law and contract, in place that makes it very difficult to circumvent the system. And I want to echo something that Chief says, is I think we all agree that this new recruit class is exactly what we want for the Seattle Police Department. It's more diverse. They have more background experience. Many speak multiple languages. We don't want to lose them. But to take a rough cut of 100 officers, that's exactly who we will lose. And I think it is really, frankly, not being honest with the city of Seattle to pretend it won't be that result. Just like it wasn't wholly honest 4 weeks ago for people to say, we're going to cut it 50% this year. And then once they looked at the facts, they realized we couldn't accomplish that.
Thank you, Mayor. And our next question will come from Natalie Graham, the stranger. Natalie, the floor is yours.
Hi, thanks. I have a question for the mayor. So you said, Mayor Durkan, that you're absolutely willing to work with the council on any of the, quote, problems before us. So why did you veto the Jumpstart Seattle spending plan?
Natalie, I'm so glad you asked that. It's a perfect example. Before they passed that plan, I talked to Councilmember Mosqueda to walk her through my deep concerns about spending so much of our rainy day and emergency funds. We were then not halfway through the year and looking at greater budget deficits next year than we had this year. We also know that in 2020, we've already had an unprecedented number of emergencies, starting with COVID relief, where we've turned $270 million of government money to try to do direct aid, where we've been working with our philanthropic partners to raise more money, and they have raised tens of millions of dollars. We then faced the economic downturn, so we've had to try to give resilience and help to our small businesses and workers and work with the governor to see what we could do to help unemployment get there quicker. And then we had the West Seattle Bridge, which is going to be a number of year challenge and crisis for the people of West Seattle. And on top of that, we've had a civil rights reckoning that has put the city to change its way it does business in so many ways. So I talked to Councilmember Mosqueda and said, look, I agree 100% that we want to do everything we can to help people in these areas. All of those areas are programs that I and my administration set up in the first month of the pandemic. But I also know that in 2 weeks we're going to get a new forecast, and that forecast is going to tell us how big a budget hole we have next year. We also knew that philanthropy was getting tens of millions of dollars that might be able to serve those needs. And I wanted to talk to our departments to see where was the need the most and how quickly we could get the dollars out the door. None of those things were done. I asked for a pause just to see that we could do this smartly, because we're in a crisis for a while. The only cushion we have is our rainy day fund and our emergency fund. That's it. That's what's going to get us through the whole next year. Otherwise, we're going to have massive layoffs at the city, have to cut services to the very people we want to help the most. And so I will work with council. I'm hoping that we can work in the next week to see if there's a different approach and different plan, talking to philanthropy to see where the holes are already filled. I know we've got a big need, particularly with undocumented workers and undocumented people who can't qualify for federal aid. Let's go to work together to solve those problems rather than talk to somebody, listen, have them consider it, and then they decide not to work together. I'm there to work with them.
Thank you, Mayor. And that concludes the Q&A portion of today's press conference. So if you would like to finish us off with any closing thoughts.
I just want to say again, and I think that that last question is, the people of Seattle in these very difficult times are going to be best served by us working together to solve these problems. And when you're talking about policing in the city of Seattle, I've worked on reform for over 30 years. Most of the significant reforms in the Seattle Police Department I was part of, either on an oversight group that recommended them, like the OPA, or as the U.S. attorney who led the investigation into the Seattle Police Department, who signed the consent decree. I am 100% committed to continuing to reform and improve the Seattle Police Department, as is Chief Best. We are also 100% committed to seeing how can we do policing better. How do we meet the voices on the streets who say to us too many black and brown people have suffered at the hands of police and too many black and brown men have been killed by police. I want to work on those issues with you. I think council and the mayor could join together with this chief of police and make Seattle a leader in the nation. But if people do not consult with the chief, if they're not realistic about what we need, if they're not realistic about what we can do, Seattle won't lead. We will fall further behind. We will lose some of our best recruits. And people in every neighborhood will feel it. No one in Seattle wants to call 911 and help show up 15 or 20 minutes later, because that's not help. And so let's work together. As mayor, I will work with you. But blunt cuts of 100 officers between now and the end of the year is really not the way to proceed. Thank you very much.